Hey everybody, it's Chris. If you're new here, I'm your host. Welcome. And if you're not new, I'm glad you're back. And well, now that we've been through a season of this, we're going to be doing a few things a little bit differently. Not too many. It's still going to be the same stories and interviews examining our history. But this time, instead of the 90s hip-hop and punk rock of last season, I'll be scoring these stories with 80s-inspired synth and electro beats, and a few other small things will change and some new things will pop in. You'll learn about those as the season progresses. But one of those new things that I wanted to start with is a setup episode that tells you how we got here. Now, this season is all about the 1980s, and while we'll definitely be covering a few important moments that are pushing the frontiers of what climbing had always looked like, mostly we're going to be focusing on the birth and the rise of a brand new style of climbing. And speaking of the 1980s and new beginnings, this is the perfect time to welcome our newest partner, Rab. Rab started in 1981 in a house in Sheffield, the center of climbing in the UK. They're generously supporting this season because they understand the importance of history and using it to inform us on how to better preserve our mountain playgrounds. And of course, our friends at Tension Climbing, who make the best training tools on the market, are back for season 2. And I'd be a little crazy if I didn't tell you about some of the new things we're doing at Power Company Climbing. It is how I pay the bills, after all. Okay, so in this short episode, I wanted to take a look at some of the factors that coalesced right there at the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s to form the foundation of what we now call sport climbing. So let's jump into it. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
As the end of the 1970s neared, climbers, more and more the world over, were wondering the same thing. How hard can we climb? In the Lake District in the UK, in the Gunks in New York, and in many other places across the globe, climbers had long been using small cliffs to train for big mountains. And some of those people would break away from that path and put their focus on those small cliffs. And just like today, every area had its own standard bearer who was leading the way. In the UK, it was Ron Fawcett and Pete Livesey. In Australia, Kim Kerrigan and Mike Law. And coming of age in France were the two Patricks, Berhault and Edlanger. And now, consider this. 12A, or 7A plus, had only recently been solidified in the mid-70s in the US, where the best climbers seemed to be concentrated. But even here, across the country, there were a small handful of climbers, usually operating in relative isolation, who were pushing their limits in various ways, far beyond the status quo. A quiet Wisconsin climber named Pete Cleveland had top roped 12D or 7C all the way back in 1969 with a route called Bagatelle at Devil's Lake. He would also go on in 1977 to top rope the blank face just to the left at 13B or 8A. In 1977, Ray Jardine, an engineer and climbing tactician ahead of his time, had been tinkering for years to improve on the idea of a camming device to protect parallel-sided cracks. Using what he called friends, he would lead the first 13A or 7C plus in Yosemite, the Phoenix, often called the world's first of the grade. And finally, in 1979, a training-obsessed 18-year-old Californian named Tony Aniro would climb Grand Illusion, a double overhanging dihedral whose grade would eventually settle at 8A, probably the first lead of that grade in the world. And let's be clear here, there were a lot of other climbers interested in challenging themselves to climb harder and harder. But there was something holding most of them back. The rules. Namely, the yo-yo ascent was the standard method of free climbing at the time. A yo-yo means that the leader would go up, placing gear. When they fell, they'd immediately lower back to the ground, no inspection of the climbing above allowed. The next climber, or that same climber after a rest, would then top rope back to the high point and attempt to climb higher. In some cases, the eventual free ascent would be a top rope to the final move before the finish. And as the levels went higher, as the climbing got harder, this method made it more and more difficult to push forward. Jardine and Yaniro, however, had employed a new tactic: hangdogging. They would hang on gear and inspect the next moves, even pulling on and climbing to the next gear placement before resting again. And this allowed them to learn the moves much faster. Nero even went as far as creating wooden replicas of the hardest parts of Grand Illusion to train for the eventual ascent. Difficulty and athleticism were starting to, for some climbers, usurp the adventure and summits and traditional ethics of the previous generations. They were breaking the rules. And along with this focus on difficulty and the scattered pockets of ethical boundary pushing, climbers were looking for new tools to support their efforts. While chalk had been introduced by John Gill back in the mid-1950s, it didn't see widespread use until the mid to late 70s, when the practice finally made its way into Europe. And for the entirety of the 70s, a board-lasted, smooth-soled shoe called the Ebe Super Gratin, or the EB here in the US, had been the universal choice for climbers. However, throughout the latter half of the 70s, a Spanish shoe manufacturer named Boreal had been formulating a rubber compound specifically for climbing. And in 1979, the first sticky rubber climbing shoe was born, the Fire. By 1983, Boreal would partner with John Backer, and the Fire would become the most sought-after shoe for free climbers. In 1985, they'd release the Ninja, the first slip-on, slip-lasted climbing shoe, helping standards jump even further. Through the 80s and into the 90s, names like John Backer, Lynn Hill, Wolfgang Gulich, Jerry Moffitt, and Ben Moon would all climb their hardest routes in Boreal shoes. And at the same time that grades were being pushed in the US, two separate bands of French climbers were contributing in their own ways. First, at a small cliff called Sassois, Parisian climbers had been coming for decades to train for the nearby Alps. They'd long been attempting to free climb the moves between the ring bolts that protected the crackless limestone. But by the mid-70s, a group, including Gilbert Tribut and the Les Ménestrel brothers Marc and Antoine, all of whom had learned to climb in Fontainebleau, were bringing their tactics, hanging on the rope to figure out hard moves, to the short, steep, pocketed walls of Sassois. And across France in the Verdon Gorge in 1976, climbers had grown tired of wondering if climbing would be possible on the massive blank walls between crack systems. Because it's easiest there to drive to the top of the canyon, they had taken to rappelling down the walls, locating the lines of holds, and placing bolts along those weaknesses. Not exactly at the same intervals you might think of today, but they were creating what could ostensibly be called the first sport climbs in the world, rappel bolted and entirely with the intention of free climbing. And in 1984, Bosch would release the first cordless rotary hammer drill, making bolting those blank walls an even easier proposition. But even with all of this, new tactics, better gear, and changing ethics, something was missing. Something that would make sport climbing a worldwide language. And even if it's just to provide guidelines to eventually move past, every game needs a rule book. So perhaps the greatest contribution to this burgeoning new offshoot of climbing would come from West Germany. Studied in mathematics and physics, Kurt Albert stood 6 feet tall with a 6'6" wingspan. Larger and more muscular than your average climber, but definitely an athlete. He'd started climbing when he was 14 years old, and like everyone else, was focused on mountaineering and aid climbing. In the early 70s, at 18 years old, he made an important trip to East Germany to climb in the Elbsandstein. Here, cut off from the rest of the world, an entirely different type of climbing had evolved. Led by Bernd Arnold, a giant of the sport who at the start of the 70s was a strong contender for the best climber in the world, and it was entirely focused on free climbing. It also had a set of rules, one that had been first laid out in 1890 and finally written down in 1913. And since then, they'd barely changed. The first 4 rules read as follows. The climber has to overcome the force of gravity's effects with his or her own physical strength on natural holds. The climber is protected by rings installed by the first ascent party, or by slings. Routes climbed partially or fully protected from above cannot be counted as first ascents. The rock surface may not be altered except for the drilling of holes for rings. Interestingly, they go on to say that first ascents can be done by anyone and that the rock shouldn't be climbed on when it's snowing or too soon after rainfall, only when it's thoroughly dry. In 1890, they were onto something. And young Kurt Albert took these ideas back to West Germany, to his home area of the Frankenjura. Coincidentally, because of the soft rock in the area, it was the custom to not remove pitons once they'd been hammered in, and one climber, Oskar Buhler, had been cementing them in place to create permanent protection points since the 1960s, when the routes in the area already numbered nearly 2,000. So Kurt had in front of him a massive playground ripe for free climbing. At first, adopting the yo-yo style used in the US and many other places, he did 20 first free ascents in one weekend. But by 1975, he wanted to distinguish when a route had been done from bottom to top, on lead, without hanging on the rope. One morning over coffee, considering how to achieve this, he turned the lid on his carafe to the pour position, lining up the large red dot with the spout. And then it hit him. That day, he drove out to a shield of rock high on a hill where there was a hard, traditional route, put up in memory of a local climber who died in the mountains. And the route had a few remaining points of aid, and Kurt thought he'd try to climb it without pulling on anything but that Bavarian limestone. Successful, he lowered to the ground and removed a small tin of paint from his pack. Carefully, at the base of the climb to indicate to other climbers that it had been done all free, he painted a red dot, a Rotpunkt. The red point was born. Now, I've heard stories of other similar systems happening in other isolated places, but none of them caught on like the simplicity of the red point. In about a decade, it would become the worldwide standard. That simple red dot would, in many ways, mark the beginning of climbing as we know it.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plug Tone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Buckle up, because we've got a great season ahead of us exploring the climbs and climbers who laid the foundations many of us still play within today. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, and please be that person at dinner parties who just won't shut up about it. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. It's good to be back with you all. I don't know where we ended off last time we talked in these, but before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to the folks who have joined the Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and especially to Aiden, Evan, Jack, Clay, Reflex, G. Siebert, Ken, and Brian, who are all members of either Rockstar or Legend status. I appreciate your support, especially in light of the fact that I didn't get nearly as many bonus episodes in there as I wanted to over the summer. I got wrapped up in trying to finish my climbing goals. I was so behind because the last winter was so hard in terms of having time, being healthy. You can probably hear right now that I'm a little bit stuffed up. Surprise, surprise. Got that from my toddler. And honestly, I just ended the winter in a pretty dark mental space. I don't know if it was depression or just being pretty down. I really don't know the difference, but I was able to work all of that out in the summer. I finished my 100 513s on the morning of my 50th birthday. It was kind of an epic final, number 100. And then, as I tend to do, immediately after I decided I want to write a book about the process, the lessons, all of that. So I just turned in the final files for that book last Friday. So that book will be coming hopefully before Christmas. Well, it'll definitely be before Christmas, but I think we'll have it ready for pre-sales on Black Friday. It's called Adapt, Lessons Learned Climbing 100 513. So that's coming. But all of that put me behind. We already pushed this back a month further than I wanted it to be, and I'm still behind, but we're going for it. We're doing it. I think I can get ahead because I've got a lot of the interviews already recorded and some great interviews. So I'm really excited to get this thing going. I'm excited to be talking to you all again. And I know I'm already starting to feel it because I'm almost done writing the official first episode, which will be next week for you all. I'm almost done with that episode, and I'm starting to get excited about piecing together all of these stories. It's a little tougher in the 80s. There's not as much written material out there that goes in depth as there was in the 90s. Which I think is interesting. So at least in the English language, there's not. We've been translating things, as you've heard in the Patreon chat, if you've been in there. Anyway, it's a little tougher, but it's making me really excited. Also, one quick thing on the subject of the music, I'm going the route of using like 80s style synth heavy samples, and I couldn't bring myself to go with like 80s drums, which were very synthetic, electronic, the TR-707, TR-808, and I'm changing my mind on that. I was sticking with 90s style drums, but I was starting to feel like I should go more electronic with the drums and just beef them up a little bit instead of the kind of flimsy nature of those original drums. And then I heard Kendrick Lamar's new album just the other day, and it's filled with 80s samples and 80s electronic drums. And I'm like, I should have just been doing this from the beginning. So those are going to come in at some point. I may go back and change some of the beats I've already made into these more electronic drums. We'll see. Anyway, that's just some behind the scenes. Coming next week, the first official episode is on the first real icon of rock climbing as we know it, of sport climbing especially, the first icon. And honestly, this one is a bit of a tragic story. I didn't realize how tragic this story was or is, and it's not written about much, frankly. I only learned a lot of these things in the interviews with people who knew him. It's given me a little bit of pause as to how to write this story. And here's the thing. He's going to come back end of the season too. He's a major figure throughout the 80s and ends the 80s with a bang. So he's coming back. So I don't have to tell the whole story just yet. I'm still working through that. But next week, we hear the beginning of that story of the very first sport climbing icon. Wow. I just talked way longer than I intended to. See you guys next week.